Prepare to enter a psychological thriller journey into the depths of the mind. A female doctor's reality is collapsing, and she must make choices between trust and betrayal, life and death. Follow her steps to uncover the dark truth hidden behind the hospital. Chapter 10 Night Terrors. Grace lay on a bed in a deserted call room. The plastic-coated mattress rustled with every breath she took. After the girl's warning, she'd decided she was too tired to investigate the ECU tonight, had returned to the annex instead. Now she lay in the musty, abandoned call room, staring into the dark, trying to will herself to sleep and failing. Maybe it was the room brought back old memories. Her body tensed as if she was still a resident, waiting for her pager to go off, primed to jump into action at a moment's notice. Fool. She didn't have a pager and she wasn't a doctor, not anymore. Not for a long time. She sighed and flopped over onto her stomach, face buried in the thin pillow, inhaling the scorched scent of hospital linens. She hadn't told the girls the entire story, about that day when she met Jimmy. Now she couldn't stop thinking about it. Her senses scanned the dark room, hoping for some sign he was here with her, but she was alone. That first night in the beehive hut she had woken to find Jimmy crouched at the fire, adding more peat to the blaze. His chest and feet were bare. The fire cast strange shadows on the rough stone walls of the hut, bizarre shapes of mythic beasts, griffin, dragon, unicorn. As he rose to his full height, silhouetted by the crackling fire, Jimmy appeared to be the master of them all. The wind tore through the air shafts with the mournful cry of a lover lost. Jimmy looked over at her, brushing soot from his hands, and their eyes met. He returned to the sleeping bag, sliding in behind her without a word. Of course, she told herself, trying to force her body to relax, there was only one sleeping bag his. It wasn't as if he'd been expecting company. She kept her eyes on the fire and realized the shadows weren't creatures, but her own clothing rescued from the sodden pile she'd abandoned it in, hung by the fire to dry. Jimmy's body stretched out behind hers. She was no longer cold, but she still shivered. He circled his arm over hers, drawing her into his chest. His body was warm, solid, safe. "What are you doing?" she asked. "I believe you Yanks call it spooning," he said, his breath rustling the hair on the crown of her head. "TSK, TSK, he crooned as her body remained tense, trembling like a child woken from a nightmare. "Go back to sleep." "I'm not a baby," she protested, her words blurred with exhaustion. "Of course not, sure. I'm 28, you know." His chuckle resonated through his chest and into her. "Then you are a baby compared to me." Silence. Grace closed her eyes, hypnotized by his steady breathing. Still, she could not lose herself in sleep. "I wouldn't have died," she whispered, too low to wake him, but loud enough for the words to take on solidity. Jimmy sighed deeply and wrapped his leg over hers, snugging her closer to him. His protectiveness irritated her. "The water would have risen, and I would have been able to swim to the tunnel, climb out by myself," she continued. He was silent, but she felt his breath catch, and knew there was a flaw in her logic. She squeezed her eyes shut, imaging her plight in the burial tomb, as a simple physics problem. The cavern was an empty wine bottle, upside down with its corked neck in a shallow pan of water. Pull the cork and water flowed into the bottle, seeking its own level. Then it stopped. Just as it had in the cavern far short of the ledge. She would have lasted maybe a few hours, trapped with escape in sight, but out of reach, until hypothermia and exhaustion took her under for the last time. Her eyes flew open and she choked as she took in a smoke-filled breath. It was the peat making her eyes water, she told herself. But she was grateful for Jimmy's hand searching out hers, entwining his fingers around hers, giving her a comforting squeeze. Jimmy stared out the window of the helipad door. He didn't like the new tower across the way. There was something about the new tower that felt unbalanced, made the hair on his neck bristle. Or it would have if he had any hair. Or a body. The only time he seemed close to being real was when Grace was there with him. Other times, he felt as empty as a beggarman's purse. More frustrating was that when Grace was near and he felt somewhat whole, he still couldn't feel her. Yet, he felt all too much of what was going on inside her. The fears, the panic, the overwhelming darkness that threatened to devour her. The pain of knowing he was the cause of it. To be suddenly yanked back into the world was one thing. To wake and find yourself drowning in the terror and sorrow that had become your beloved's daily existence was quite another. Christ, what he wouldn't give to be whole again, to find some way to heal Grace and to get his hands on the bastard who had done this to her. This he prayed with all his might, his gaze locked onto dark shadows moving past the windows of the tower opposite the helipad. In answer to his prayer, rain slashed against the door, and a man's laughter rang through the deserted hallway. "Don't fret, Jimmy," the man he'd known in life as Brother Leo said. "There's not many who could have come as far as you have, even with my help." Jimmy spun around. Or rather he changed the direction of his attention, and the building shifted around him. Leo lounged against the elevator doors, his silver hair falling around his face like a lion's mane. His eyes were darker than the storm-tossed night, darker than Jimmy had ever noticed them to be when he was alive. As if Leo were more demon than man. "About time you returned." Jimmy's voice thundered with emotion despite the fact he had no vocal cords, or even a mouth to form the words. "What is this, then? Some kind of purgatory? I pay for my sins by watching Grace suffer. There is no purgatory. I explained that to you when I brought you here. There's no heaven or hell either, only time. Riddles and rhymes. I want answers. You said I was here to help Grace, tell me how. You've done your job. You kept her here. Now you can go." "Like hell I will." "You've no choice in the matter," Leo said with a nonchalant wave of his hand, dismissing Jimmy. Jimmy felt icy fingers tug at his heart, trying to yank him back into the void from which he came. "No. I'm not leaving her. Not again, damn it." He reached out for Grace. In his mind's eye he saw her tossing on the narrow bed of the call room. She was dreaming about the first night they met. He felt her hand reach out, weaving her fingers between his, felt her squeeze his hand tight, holding on for dear life. Jimmy fastened onto the memory, pulling from her strength. He pushed the cold emptiness back and watched as Leo's expression turned to surprise. "I'm not going anywhere," Jimmy told the former Jesuit. His hand was clenched at his side, he imagined Grace's hand holding it, anchoring him. Leo's face creased into a smile. "No? I guess not. So, what are you going to do? You can't stay here forever," drawing on Grace's strength. "I don't intend to stay forever. Just long enough to see Grace out of danger." Grace remembered Jimmy holding her that first night. In her half-dream state, she could almost feel the weight of his arm, his breath rustling her hair, the beat of his heart slow and steady as she shivered in fear. "I'm sorry," she had muttered, both embarrassed and comforted by his presence. "For what?" "Being scared." His grip around her tightened. "Let me guess. Your damned priests taught you to have faith, that fear was useless. Idiots." She craned her head toward him, surprised by his bitterness. "What's wrong with faith? And you a scientist?" Christians seem to believe they created the concept of blind belief in a higher power. Nonsense. 1,000 years before Christ, pagans like Maeve had faith. It was that faith that almost got her killed. What happened? He sat up on his elbow, looking down on her, shadows from the fire dancing over his face. They could have been living thousands of years in the past, him an ancient druid or warrior poet, spinning his tale. What happened? We are talking 1652 BC here, young lady. What do you think happened? She shrugged. The date meant nothing to her. Christ save me from children who don't know past what they see on a bloody computer screen. 1652 BC. As in the eruption of Thera, the most powerful volcanic explosion in history. 100 times the force of Hiroshima, it was heard over 2,000 miles away. 1652 As in the plagues of Egypt, the parting of the Red Sea, a colossal tsunami 90 feet high, powerful enough to destroy the palace at Zakros and eradicate the entire Minoan civilization. Any of this ringing bells? Moses and all that, she replied hesitantly. He rolled his eyes. A wandering Jew in the right place at the right time. How about this, then? Fall of Atlantis. She perked up at that. Santorini they call it now. A Greek island. They uncovered houses, beautiful artwork, frescoes and statues, as well as feats of engineering far advanced from anything expected. Electroplating, metalworking, knowledge of medicine and mathematics, even the first known computer all over 3,000 years ago. Now he beamed at her as if she were a star pupil. Right? Santorini is Thera or Callista, as the Minoans who lived there called it. But what's important is that they found no human bodies, only remains of a few livestock. Not a single person was left behind. They all disappeared, scattered to the four winds and beyond. She twisted around to sit cross-legged before him, enchanted by his tale of ancient history. He gestured with his hands as he continued, beads and artifacts traced back to that period and a Mediterranean origin have been found beneath the stones of Stonehenge, in ancient Mayan ruins in Belize, along the coast of France and Africa. An entire population vanished, leaving only bits and pieces behind. She smiled at the passion in his voice. What do the people of Atlantis Callistians? Callistians have to do with Maeve. It is my belief, his chest puffed out as if he were preparing to ward off any word of ridicule or rebuttal, that the Callistians came here to the west coast of Ireland. And Maeve found them. Jimmy shoved aside the remnants of Grace's memories, trying to keep his focus in the here and now. A here and now where he wasn't meant to exist at all. Leo pushed away from the wall, flaunting the fact that he had a body to push with, and strode toward Jimmy. You really think you can save her, do you? He demanded. Has it occurred to you that maybe she can't be saved? That maybe she's here to save someone else? Like who? Jimmy felt anger surge through him. Somehow the strong emotions seemed to help him stay whole, help to keep him from disintegrating back into the void. What kind of games are you playing with us, old man? It's no game. It's deadly serious. And sometimes people must be sacrificed. No. I won't allow it. You can bring me back from the dead, you must have it in your power to save her. It's not a question of what I can or cannot do. It's all up to her. Free will. I can suggest influence, but only she can decide what is to come next. Jimmy considered that. He didn't trust the Jesuit, devil, demon, or whatever Leo Augustine was in reality. But the man had knowledge, power Jimmy needed. How do you do it? He asked, forcing himself to sound meek, awestruck. Keep your body as if you were alive. Are you alive? In fact, Leonard Augustine is alive now. Alive and well and living in Los Angeles, as a matter of fact. But he's not me, not yet. And he never will be, not if Grace gets the job done. You're from the future. Jimmy's head began to throb as he tried to follow Leo's explanation. Listen here, my boy. Einstein had the right idea. Energy, mass, time. All tied together. When we die, we release energy. Think of all those billions of cells, powered by millions of mitochondria, tiny atomic energy plants. Most of us simply scatter, our energy drifting along the tides of time. Unless, Jimmy prompted. Unless you have enough energy to hold onto a bit of your consciousness. Then, if you pay attention and find a way to harness more energy, you'll find time is like ripples on a pond. It can travel either forward or back. You can skip like a stone in either direction. If your will and focus are strong enough. So you've traveled here from the future. What happens to Grace? How can I save her? The monk snorted a short laugh. Christ, you're just as stubborn as Maeve. I haven't only traveled back from the future, I've traveled all through time. You met Maeve 3,500 years ago. I was the one who warned the Callistians and sent them on their way to Ireland. I was there with Maeve's stubborn woman. Focused on her own wants instead of the greater good. Just like you. I was there on Calvary during the crucifixion, rode beside the lion heart, as he destroyed Palestine in the name of that same God, comforted Joan before she burned at the stake. I've tried to warn, to influence, to guide them all, but nothing has changed. Time is catching up. Grace is my last chance. Jimmy felt his pulse race at the mention of the great figures of history. You've seen so much. Why here, why now, why Grace? Everything I've done has been in an attempt to rebalance the universe, to prevent a great evil from emerging. He looked down as if suddenly ashamed. Jimmy had the sense that this evil was personal to Leo. Was it maybe something Leo had failed to stop himself? What evil? What do you want Grace to do? How can she stop it? Jimmy wanted to wring the answers from Leo, but could only listen, helpless. There lies the rub. I can observe, suggest, influence. Free will still reigns supreme. Jimmy would have paced if he had feet. But you're solid. You have mass. If you're like me dead. Right? How did I told you? Energy, mass, time. Enough energy and you can create mass, but you lose your freedom to travel through time. Give up the mass and you can go where and when you want. It's just physics. Laws of the universe. This good versus evil is no law of the universe, Jimmy argued. Morals are imposed by men, society. Not physics. We don't have time to argue philosophy. Have you never heard of the entropy effect? Everything is headed toward destruction from the moment it's created. There you go. Destruction equals chaos, chaos equals evil. Lesson over. Come, my boy, if you're going to stick around, then I've got work for you. No? I want to see Grace. I want to be with Grace. Leo smiled and Jimmy realized the monk had just been playing with him, stalling for time. So sorry, you've missed your chance. While you were prattling on about morals and semantics, she crossed over into the tower. There you cannot follow. Kat sat sideways on the couch, her head cradled by the window. 1 o'clock. Only 5 more hours before daylight again. Maybe they'd even see the sun today. Instead of grey steel clouds that swallowed all light. She dared to hope. She stifled a yawn, then pinched herself to keep awake. She could do 5 hours, piece of cake. Sleep was overrated anyway. Her door opened a crack, allowing light from the hallway to spill inward. Kat jumped and turned guiltily to the woman in the doorway. I was just going to the bathroom, the words rushed out, her voice tight with fear. I am going right back to bed. It's okay, Kat. It's me. Grace entered and joined her at the couch. Grace? You shouldn't come here not alone, not at night. Why not? I was worried about you. Kat straightened. Don't worry about me. I'm fine. Grace was silent for a moment, her gaze never leaving Kat's face. She took Kat's hand in hers and gave it a reassuring squeeze. What's so scary that you won't go to sleep? What didn't scare her? Kat thought with chagrin. She remained silent for a long moment, but the idea of someone listening, of being there in the dark with her, was too compelling to ignore. Sometimes I'm frightened I won't wake up, or if I do, I won't be me anymore. I'll be a vegetable, drooling and peeing my pants, not able to walk or talk. Or worse, I'll still be me on the inside, but no one will know. You mean like in a coma? Yes, but awake on the inside. It's called the locked box syndrome, Grace told her. Locked box? Yeah, it feels like being buried alive in a coffin, locked in with no way out again. Feels like. Kat, when did this happen to you? Kat fought against the shudder the memory brought with it and lost. Grace pulled her into her arms. Last week, Kat whispered. When the witch took me. Who took you? Took you where? Kat began to weep. She hated to admit it, but it felt good to have a grown-up care about her, not that her parents didn't, but they had too much to think about and Kat was already such a burden to them. Snap out of it, she told herself. Think of all those kids your age out on the streets, fending for themselves, or drafted to fight wars, starving in Africa. You've got it easy, 3 meals a day, roof over your head, your own bathroom. Just cause your brain doesn't work right is no reason to get all whiny and wimpy. Tell me what happened, Grace said. Kat wiped her nose on her pajama sleeve. She kept her other hand entwined with Grace's. That wasn't being a wimp, was it? She needed the contact to give her strength to face the memory of last Thursday night. My surgery was supposed to be last week, she began. But they didn't have enough data to build the map of my brain. They need that so they don't cut out the good parts, what little's left. But you sabotaged the download. Alex told me. Yeah, I just wanted to wait till after my birthday. I know it sounds stupid, but that's all right, I understand. The witch Dr. Warden figured out that I was turning off my recorder. So she called my parents and told them not to visit because I wasn't cooperating. I only get to see them once a week anyway, so that was really unfair. Her voice tightened and she was afraid she'd start crying again. But she took a deep breath and didn't. She had no right to do that, Grace said. You're a child, alone here facing a serious illness. Of course you need your parents beside you. I'm not a child. Kat said. I don't need my parents. Anyway, they've got too much to take care of, the farm, my brothers and sisters. She shook her head, the electrodes rattling. I can take care of myself. What else did Dr. Warden do? That night she had the nurse bring me over to the room for a treatment. She gave me that drug of hers, Lucidine, you know it. Grace went rigid. Lucidine? Are you certain? When Grace had been a resident, Lucidine was just entering its clinical trials. There was one study in the ER and several upstairs in the OR. She never liked the drug even though patients said they felt no pain during procedures. The drug spooked Grace. She'd seen several people have an adverse reaction. The feeling of being out of control, totally at someone else's mercy, and yet still aware of what was happening was too much for some patients. Just like being buried alive. Why did she give you the Lucidine? She said it would help me not to sabotage what the doctors were doing. The nurse gave it to me and suddenly it was like I was dead. I couldn't feel anything, could hardly breathe, couldn't talk, couldn't see, but I could hear, smell, taste. And then what happened? Did someone hurt you? Grace tried to keep the fury from her voice. That warden had so little consideration for a child's feelings, much less her welfare, was unconscionable. It's all right, you can tell me. When I was a kid, just 7 or so, I fell off my horse and broke my arm. It really, really hurt and I was so scared, I thought I was gonna die or something. All of a sudden after they gave me the Lucidine I started feeling that same pain again. I heard Dr. Warden's voice telling me that if I tried to turn off my recorder the pain would come back. She said it over and over and over and I kept feeling the pain, only it wasn't in my arm, it was in my head, and I wanted to scream, get her to stop, tell her I'd be good. Cat choked down fresh tears, but I couldn't. I couldn't get her to stop. Grace pulled her close. Kat's sobs racked through her body. It's all right. It won't happen again, I promise. She glanced out the dark window, the lights of Pittsburgh obscured by rain and mist. Can you wait for me just a little longer, Jimmy? I won't let it happen. Kat's extreme reaction to the Lucidine was probably because of her underlying brain damage from the Rasmussens. But that didn't excuse Warden's behavior. The doctor should have known better than to use a drug like Lucidine on a patient with neurologic abnormalities. And to misuse a drug to punish a child. Warden would pay for it, Grace promised herself. Dearly. What do you want? She asked Kat once the girl's sobs had calmed down. Do you want me to call your parents, tell them what happened? They could report Warden. Kat shook her head vigorously. No, you can't do that. They'd send me home, tell me to have the operation somewhere else, and my parents can't afford that. If I stay here, they don't have to pay for anything. Want me to talk to Dr. Warden? Another head shake. You'll just get her mad and she'll do something else. You don't know what she's capable of. Grace was certain that Kat was overreacting, but then she remembered the feeling of dread that overwhelmed her every time she came close to the ECU. Maybe something more was going on here. Like what? Has she done anything else to hurt you? Not me. But some of the other freaks don't call yourself that, Grace told her sternly. Kat, you're a beautiful young lady, not a freak. Yeah, that's me, the girl with half a brain. Anyway, the skeleton, her real name's Angie, Kat amended when she caught Grace's look of disapproval. She's only been here a few weeks. She used to cut and scratch herself a lot, and she'd make herself throw up after she ate anything. She was crying in her room the other day and I went in, asked her what was wrong, and she asked me to cut her. You know, Kat, some kids do that kind of thing as a cry for help, Grace floundered. What the hell did she know about helping an 11, almost 12-year-old understand these things? Oh, I know, Kat said in an off-handed manner. One of the girls in my class used to do it. She was nuts. Anyway, Angie said she couldn't do it herself. Anytime she tried, her body went numb. Not only couldn't she use her hand to cut herself, but even if she could manage to scrape herself on something like the radiator, she couldn't feel it anymore, not since her treatments. And she was scared. 'Cause she said the pain she felt when she cut herself let her know she was alive, and if she was alive then there was still some hope. But if she couldn't feel anything, then what was the point of living? What did you do? I pinched her real hard and she yelled. And I told her not to give up 'cause she was definitely still alive. Grace looked down on the girl, almost woman, before her, and couldn't suppress a tear of her own. She wished she had someone like Kat around when she'd been fighting her own battle between suicide and hope. Then she remembered Brother Leo sitting at her bedside in the ICU. And after she went home, she'd found Ingrid. Guess she was lucky after all. Is Angie all right now? Kat shrugged. She doesn't cry anymore, but she doesn't smile either. And she won't talk to me. Says this is something she has to work on alone, whatever that means. I think it means the same thing as when you tell your parents not to come more often because you're just fine, Grace said gently. Kat looked down. Oh? I didn't think of it that way. I know you and Alex think delaying your surgery won't be a problem. But the sooner you get it over with, the sooner you get to go home. Kat jerked her head up at that and Grace saw the panic in her eyes. Sabotaging her surgery had nothing to do with her parents or her birthday, she realized. It had everything to do with fear. Has anyone talked to you about what happens after your operation? Kat shook her head and wouldn't meet Grace's eyes. Half my brain will be gone. What if it's the half that the kids at school like? Or the part that can whistle even better than my dad can? What if I forget my parents and brothers and sisters, even my dog and my horse? What if, her voice dropped to a whisper, I don't wake up at all? Not dead, but not alive either. What's in between? Grace lifted Kat's chin, directing the girl's gaze back toward her. Kat, I promise it won't be like that. Did you know that you only use a portion of your brain to start with? So that leaves a whole lot left over that you weren't even using. After the operation you'll have trouble using one side of your body, maybe some trouble talking and chewing, but you're young and you'll get stronger. Things won't be the same as before, but if you don't have the surgery, the seizures will kill you. Kat nodded gravely. Will I remember everything? I won't be a retard, will I? No, you won't. But you might forget a few things. It's hard for me to predict without knowing what parts of your brain have been affected by the Rasmussens. So you don't know either, Kat said, a hint of bitter disappointment in her voice. Not right now. But if I can get to your chart, maybe I can find out more. Would that help? Kat nodded. How about we make a deal? You and Alex stop sabotaging your recording, and I'll try to figure out a way to sneak a look at your chart. Deal? Kat took Grace's outstretched hand and shook it. Deal. But don't come over here at night anymore. That's when they let the beast out. Don't worry about me. How about if you get some sleep? It's late. Kat left the couch and crawled into her bed. Grace sat beside her and held her hand until she drifted off to sleep. It was 3 a.m. when Grace left Kat's side. The ECU was quiet, the lights dimmed. All over the hospital, all over the city, people slept, closer to death at this hour than at any other. It was a time of night that Grace was well acquainted with. The time when nightmares hit, the time when dawn seemed too far out of reach, the new day it brought as hopeless as the last. A time when souls wandered, slipping the barriers between what was real and what was not. Grace usually never allowed herself to sleep at this time of night, too risky in so many ways. No, 3 a.m. wasn't a time for slumber, not in Grace's world. It was the time to fortify oneself with strong coffee and buckle down, get the work that kept a roof over her head done. Then, finally, when the sun dared to show its face again, then she could think of going to bed, take a chance on a few hours of vulnerability. She left Kat's room and crept down the thickly carpeted hall toward the rear of the nurse's station where the patient charts were kept. Now would be the best time to keep her promise to Kat. Then she'd be free to leave in the morning, free to go home where she belonged. Where Jimmy was waiting for her to join him. Forever. She sucked in her breath, overwhelmed for a moment by the longing to be back in her house, surrounded by familiar smells and sounds and sights. Jimmy's face looking down on her as she worked on her computer. Even locked behind the cold glass of a photo frame, his smug grin lent her warmth, strength. Please God. Let me find a way out of this place. I just want to go home. Grace shook away her childish wishes. She of all people knew the futility of praying to a faceless God. She ducked her head around the corner of the nurse's station, and checked to be certain it was empty before she crept inside. She knelt in front of the chart rack, below the sight line of anyone passing in the corridor. Kat had been here long enough that 2 thick volumes bore her name. She grabbed the first and leaned back against the wall. Down the hall a door swished open. Footsteps approached, accompanied by a man's breathy whistling. She pulled her knees to her chest and slid behind the chart rack into the dark space below the countertop. The footsteps passed her. Keys rattled in the secure door at the end of the hallway. Where Alex said the beast lived. She wondered what kind of patient earned that sobriquet, and the need for locked doors. A woman's voice came from nearby. Dr. Warden. A man's voice answered. A voice that sliced into Grace's very marrow, releasing a swarm of wasps and terror. Grace curled into a ball, squeezed her eyes shut as panic overwhelmed her. She had a good idea who the beast was. Chapter 11. The Beast. Eve removed the last of the electrodes from Lukas's shaved scalp. Let's go over everything we covered tonight, she told him. Lukas looked up at her with glassy blue eyes, his usual look, not a side effect of the lucidine therapy. But he was more engaged now than he had been when they began therapy 4 months ago. He flexed and closed his long, skinny fingers, but otherwise sat perfectly motionless, his body slumped in the chair, watching her with that almost vacant stare, as if trying to judge if she was real or not. Tell me about your wife. Gracie. Gracie is my wife. His face became animated, his gaze bounced around the room as if his wife hid in a corner. Is? Eve frowned. Tonight's session had been frustrating, all the ground she'd gained over the past 4 months lost again, for unknown reasons. She pounded her fist against her thigh. Renee Redding was not going to like this. Not at all. And if Renee wasn't happy with Lukas' progress, then Eve would lose the funding for her private clinic. You mean, was right? No? Lukas frowned, concentrated on twisting his wedding band. Eve had tried repeatedly to get him to stop wearing it, decided when that finally happened, she'd know that her treatment was a complete success. Until tonight, she'd thought that might be any day now. Our 5th wedding anniversary is coming up this May. Damn it. She'd worked so hard she couldn't stand it that those idiot psychiatrists at Western Psych might be right. They'd had Lukas for almost 4 years and got nowhere, said his delusions were fixed, he was beyond treatment, psychotic. But with the help of lucidine, she'd been able to replace those delusions with a new reality, one that would render the man harmless to society. It was to be lucidine's greatest triumph when Lukas was re-evaluated in 2 weeks. The launch pad for her own clinic, supported by the government grants Renee Redding promised her after she cured the lobbyist's son. Renee also assured her a steady stream of private patients once lucidine therapy was validated. Lukas, she injected the venom she felt into her voice. We've been through this. You and Gracie were married, but what happened on your honeymoon? Do you remember driving home from the airport? The drunk driver swerving into your lane. Remember, Lukas? He squinted at her, brow creased in a frown as he tried to separate his delusions from the alternate reality Eve had programmed his brain to respond to. She leaned forward, took his hand. Think, Lukas. Remember the blood? Her screams. He nodded as if in a trance. I remember blood. I remember screaming. That was right, big boy. Only it had nothing to do with a drunk driver. When Eve first got Lukas, sent to her by his lawyer after a long court battle and a lot of string pulling by his wealthy, politically connected mother, he'd thought every woman with dark hair or wearing white was his Gracie. It had taken a lot of creativity to devise a program of therapy for him. She hadn't even had a photo of the real Grace to start with. The police had refused to release the file to her. But she'd begun with various stimuli and monitored Lukas' response. Certain chairs became synonymous with Gracie, as did knives with long, wicked blades. Anything the color of blood. Finally, he'd begun to respond. Until tonight. Now Lukas fought her every step of the way. I had my hands around his throat, he continued in a low whisper. He deserved to die for what he did to my Gracie. Eve sighed, patted her hair back into place. They'd make more progress tomorrow. Now that fate had intervened and deposited the real Grace into her hands, giving her the final trigger she needed to cure Lukas. Eve would use Grace Moran's presence to introduce more realistic stimuli and expedite the therapy. But time was running out. She needed to get Hellman's patient up here, under her control before Moran's surgery. If the woman died under Hellman's knife, she was no good to Eve. Grace Moran was the key to Eve's future. That's enough for tonight, Lukas. Let's get you back in bed. She motioned for the orderly to go ahead and open the door to the locked ward. Lukas was its only resident, and he was doing so well that during the daytime, when there was enough staff, he was free to roam the unit. Not that he did. He spent most of his time in his room, working at the computer his mother had brought, only occasionally venturing to the door. Sometimes the nurses, who all believed the same fantasy Eve was programming him with, would coax him as far as the nurses' station, where they would play cards, or give him a book to read. Lukas stood, his gaze still fixed on his silver wedding band, shuffling toward the door. They headed toward the locked room at the end of the hall where the orderly waited. As they passed the nurses' station, Lukas suddenly froze, raised his head, eyes wide as he sniffed the air. "She's here. Gracie, where are you?" "Gracie!" His shouts reverberated through the empty corridor. He began pounding his fists on the closed doors along the hallway. Eve tried to grab his arm, but he flailed out, knocking her off her feet. The orderly dashed down the hall and tackled Lukas. As they wrestled on the floor, Eve rushed to the medication cart inside the nurses' station. In 4 months, he'd never been violent. What the hell had gone wrong? What had set him off? She punched in her security code and grabbed a syringe full of Haldol. Lukas blocked her way out, lunged at her, teeth bared. "I know she's in there," he screamed at Eve. "Why are you hiding her from me?" Eve looked around. Other than her, the nurses' station was empty. The orderly regained his feet and slammed Lukas against the wall. Lukas bucked and writhed against the bigger man's weight, but this time the orderly was able to hold him. It couldn't be the lucidine making him act this way. Eve jammed the needle into his biceps. It just couldn't be. Grace cowered behind the cart rack, hidden in the shadows beneath the counter. Her hands covered her head, ready to ward off the blows that would come any second. The wasps tore through her skin, their exuberant buzzing ricocheting off the insides of her skull. He was back. They said he was gone, had promised, but he was back. He was coming for her, all over again. It was happening all over again, and there was nothing she could do. Her body trembled and sweat soaked the thin cotton scrub top she wore. She tasted blood, bit her lip harder in an effort to keep from screaming in terror. "Jimmy, come get me, take me home, please Lord, not again. Jimmy, where are you?" Her tears burnt her eyes, but Jimmy didn't come. Her eyes closed tight on a vision of blood, Jimmy's face, but not Jimmy, not anymore. Lukas had won that time and now it was just her. Alone. Jimmy wasn't here, wouldn't come here, was powerless to stop Lukas, stop the beast. The screaming out in the hallway came to an abrupt halt. It was replaced by the sound of a man cursing and a body being dragged away. A door slammed shut. Then there was silence. Dead silence. Even the wasps seemed afraid to come out of hiding. Grace peered through the spaces between her fingers. Nothing moved. She crawled away from the chart rack, dared to look out in the hall. She could see figures silhouetted behind the thick glass of the locked ward. No one else was visible. Now or never. She pushed off like a sprinter in the race of her life and ran down the corridor, not stopping until she was halfway through the skyway leading to the annex. She didn't dare to look back, just caught her breath and kept on running. Not the annex. She couldn't bear to be alone, not now. Try for home. Jimmy would be there, or would he? What if she made it home and found it empty? No Jimmy, no Ingrid, no one to protect her when the beast came for her again. He knew where she lived. It was the first place he would look for her. So where would the last be? Chapter 12. Light of day. Vincent always started his morning by checking on his sickest patients. And right now there was no one on PEDS more critical than Alex Weiss. But Vincent was smiling as he pushed open the door to Alex's room. He'd finally been able to convince the ethics committee to place Alex on the list for a heart-lung transplant, and waiting in his inbox this morning had been a message that UNOS had approved Alex and made him level 1, the highest priority. Vincent couldn't wait to tell Alex, to be able to offer the boy something besides comfort measures. He grabbed the clipboard from its hook beside the door and went inside. Then stopped. A woman lay beside Alex in his bed, her arm snuggled around the boy's shoulder, his hand entwined in hers, as if he was grabbing onto a lifeline. What the hell? Who had allowed a stranger into his patient's room? Vincent dropped the clipboard to the bedside table and stalked over to the side of the bed where the woman slept, the side of her face cradled against the top of Alex's head. Night and day is what they looked like, her long dark hair tousled against Alex's blonde curls. "Hey, Sleeping Beauty," Vincent tried to pitch his voice low enough that Alex wouldn't be disturbed. No answer except for the soft snuffle of stereophonic snores. "You've got to get out of here, or I'm gonna call security," he continued. Still no response. But then, anyone who could sleep through the noise of a hospital ward must be a sound sleeper. He wished he could sleep that deeply. Before the Engagen case, he could. He touched the woman's bare arm. Who had given her a set of scrubs? Did she work here? He didn't recognize her. A stray beam of sunlight slid through the window, casting her profile into relief. Vincent stopped, caught by the secrets the light revealed. She might have been beautiful once, but something had happened. The light exposed thin whispers of scars lining her face. One angled through one eyebrow and across her forehead, another through her cheek and upper lip. They'd been expertly repaired, but now that he was looking, Vincent saw that bones had been broken as well. One cheekbone was slightly higher than the other. She shifted and the blanket slid from her right arm. Both arms were crisscrossed with scars. A gold wedding band and emerald engagement ring circled the fourth finger of her left hand. The only time he'd ever seen injuries like these was after some sonofabich had thrown his wife through a plate glass window. The sunlight grew stronger now, glinting off a row of surgical staples closing a fresh laceration in her scalp. Vincent backed away. She'd gone back, let the sick bastard do it again. Why did women do that? He remembered his college girlfriend, Mona. Well, at least he'd thought she was his girlfriend. She kept going back to her ex, a lacrosse player, who would torment her, drag her down, and then beat her senseless and kick her out. She'd end up on Vincent's couch for a few days, igniting his hope that this time she'd see what was going on, stay for good, then one day he'd wake up and she'd be gone again. Finally, he went to confront the bastard only to have Mona call the cops on him and try to hit him with a lamp before they came. He'd fled, vowed never to get involved with anyone that needy again. He'd never heard from her again until he read in the paper that she'd married the lacrosse player. Probably was still letting the guy use her as a punching bag. He knew you weren't supposed to blame the victim, but the way Mona kept leaving him, going back for more, that spoke of some fatal flaw in the psyche. So, how had this refuge from the woman's shelter ended up in his patient's bed? He was about to shake her awake, demand answers, when the door was flung open and Kat Jellicle flew in. "Alex." "I can't find the girl," caught sight of Vincent and skidded to a stop, one hand over her mouth. Vincent looked from Kat back to the two on the bed. Alex was awake now, as was the woman, both staring at him with twin pairs of eyes the same startling hue of blue. The woman jerked as if surprised she had fallen asleep and sat up. Alex kept hold of her hand when she tried to remove it. "Don't go," he said, his voice raspy with sleep. The woman looked down at Alex with a smile. "It'll be all right." Her voice was smooth, hypnotic even. Vincent shook off his reverie. He didn't care if she sang like an angel, she didn't belong here. And who the hell was she to be telling a critically ill child that everything would be all right? "Who are you?" Vincent demanded. She looked at him, those brilliant blue eyes lighting on his face like a monarch butterfly coming to rest. "What are you doing here with my patient?" She blinked once, remained silent, as if she didn't have the answers to his question. To hell with this. He wasn't going to play the sap, not again. "I'm calling security." Kat stepped between them. "Dr. V, you don't understand. Go back to your room, Kat." Vincent reached for the phone on the bedside table. "Please don't," Alex's voice carried across the room. "She didn't do anything wrong. Don't make her go. She's Alex's mother, Kat said in a gush and grabbed Vincent's arm. There was a sudden hush in the room, as if all the air had been sucked out of it. Vincent dropped the phone and turned to the children. They were easier to face than the woman with her quiet, hypnotic stare. That's impossible. I don't know what she told you. No, it's true, Kat rushed on. She gave him up, but then his new parents left him here, when he got sick, and she'd been looking for him ever since. Alex nodded in time with her words, his face lighting up with a smile. She came all the way from Minnesota. Kat finished and took a deep breath. It's true, Alex said. Vincent looked from one child to the other, then forced himself to face the woman. She had slipped her hand from Alex's and now stood at the side of the bed, arranging her crumpled scrubs back into place with nervous hands. The silence grew. Vincent was certain she would elaborate on Kat's impossible story, waited for her to tangle herself in her own lies. Show her true colors to the children she had deceived. What did she want? A roof over her head, until she decided to return to the man who beat her. Did she think she could somehow profit by this ridiculous charade? She surprised him by taking a deep breath and extending her right hand. I'm Marie D'Angelo, she said, her voice forthright, her gaze rising to meet his. Her hand was warm in his, her grip strong. She had the shortest fingernails he'd ever seen on a woman, and her fingertips were rough with calluses. He held her hand a fraction too long, but she didn't pull away. Then he let her go. And you're Alex's long-lost mother. He had wanted to cut her with sarcasm, but instead his words came out filled with wonder. As if he might believe. Her gaze held his. I'm here to take care of him. Funny. I thought that was my job. Grace fought hard to stay on her feet. Nowhere to go, nowhere to hide. The angry swarm of wasps buzzed around her head, dive-bombing at her as she forced herself to remain where she was, to face the man before her. He wore green cotton scrubs, a stethoscope around his neck, and a look of chronic fatigue now tempered by suspicion. He glanced from her to the two children, obviously protective of them. Grace stood frozen, fighting to control her breathing. Gr Marie, this is Dr. Vincent Embark, Alex's doctor, Kat intervened once more. Isn't it great, Dr. V? After all these years, Alex's real mom finally found him. She had to hire a detective to track him down, and she drove all the way here from. Kat faltered for a mere second, as she spun her tale. Minnesota, she finished triumphantly. Yes, that's what you said before. The man's eyes had locked onto Grace and refused to release her. All the way from Minnesota. Dr. Embark scrutinized her face, his gaze resting on the staples in her scalp. Must have been some trip. I was in an accident. Grace heard her own voice sounding calm and assured, traveling from someplace far away from the here and now where wasps buzzed through her, and the sharp edge of panic bit into her every breath. Got banged up pretty good. But she made it, Alex put in, reached over to take Grace's hand once more. The buzz of the insects immediately receded and she could breathe. Isn't it great, Dr. V? Kat was bouncing on her feet, one hand tapping Vincent's arm, as if she hoped enthusiasm was contagious. The doctor nodded slowly. So you're Alex's mother, he continued in a pleasant drawl. Kat opened her mouth, but stopped when Grace cut her eyes at her. No telling what the next fantastic lie would be. I was young. I made a mistake letting him go, Grace said quietly. I didn't even see Alex before they took him away. But I knew him. She looked down at Alex and smiled. Knew him as well as my own heartbeat. You know that ache you get when there's a storm coming and the wind shifts direction. She looked up at the man and saw him nodding, listening intently. His eyes were softer now, no longer narrowed in suspicion. That split second of a vacuum, when all the breath is sucked out of you, and there's this painful emptiness that threatens to swallow you whole. That's the feeling I've had ever since Alex was torn from me, as if my breath was ripped away, shredded by the storm. Grace and Vincent stared at each other in silence. He straightened and sniffed at the air, testing for a sudden change in the wind. Marie is a poet, Kat told Vincent with excitement and awe in her voice. I can tell. Vincent smiled down at Alex. You're a lucky guy to have a mom like this. His words came slowly, a man hypnotized, immersed in an illusion he'd decided not to struggle against. Vincent sucked in his breath, blew it out again, and the spell was broken. Then he straightened and turned to Kat. You are supposed to be in your room. The tech is waiting for your download. Kat sighed dramatically. That's all I am to you people, she told them as she made her exit. A walking database of information. I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille, she said with a hand swept up to her forehead. I've got to get these kids some new videos, Vincent muttered. Alex is due for a therapy session now, he told Grace. But he'll be back by the time we are done. Done with what? Alex asked. Your mom and I have a lot to talk about. Grace leaned over, kissed Alex's forehead. It's all right. I'll see you soon. He smiled and gave her a B-movie wink. Bye, Mom. We've only just scratched the surface of medical ethics and human emotions. Want to delve deeper into Grace's story and the science behind it? Subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analysis.